Welcome back, this is Dynamic Variables Part 4, where we're going to talk about the logics nodes. There is some prerequisite knowledge for this, which is ideally all three of the preceding parts, which are linked to the video description, but optionally you can just watch Part 1 and then come here if you would like to. You will need the Part 1 at least, though, to get some background information about how dynamic variables work, or some of this might make sense to you. If you have any questions, do leave them in the comments. As always, I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Let's get going. Let's hop over here to Smooth POV, and we'll get some stuff set up. Of note here, we will be needing the developer tooltip and the logics tooltip for this tutorial. The reason of this is because the logics nodes here will interact with the components that exist within your world hierarchy when they are doing dynamic variable operations. Let's get going by creating a space. We can use one of the default spaces that exist. These will also be mentioned in the video description, but we're going to create our own just so that we've got freedom to play around and we know that we're not going to mess anything up. Let's go ahead and equip our developer tool here and go to create new empty object, and we're going to call this our variable space. So I'm going to enter, I hit shift there, variable space. There you go, variable space. I'm going to attach the dynamic variable space component to it. That is an attached component, data dynamic variable space. And we're going to put in the space name. We'll be using a space name here. You don't have to, but I do advise most of the time using a space name if you want to keep things organized. So I'm just going to call the space name space. With this dynamic variable space set up, we can go ahead and start looking at the nodes for the dynamic variable system. I'm going to go ahead here and equip my logics tooltip and turn to the right here, and I'm going to open up the logics tooltip here and go to the node browser, and let's go ahead and find out what those nodes are, and I can talk about them and then we'll get started. So you can find all the dynamic variable nodes in the variables folder here. The variables folder recently changed with the introduction of dynamic variables to be like this, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. As of note, if you are watching a video that is from before this update, so before dynamic variables existed, you would see the storage variables, as in this sort of colorful display of various variable types, in that storage folder within my videos. I apologize for that. Sometimes things get updated. I update videos that are totally out of date, but if they're just a little bit out of date, then I'm happy to just answer questions in the comments. So other than that storage folder, which contains those regular storage variables, you'll see that the rest of this folder is entirely dynamic variable related. So we're going to take a look at each of these in turn. Some of them operate in similar ways to each other, but they all operate with sort of common systems and syntax. We're going to start with my favorite nodes from this folder, which are the dynamic variable input and dynamic variable input with events. We'll start with dynamic variable input and then go on to the event one. Let's spawn a dynamic variable input. When you select a node that looks like this, if you trigger on it, you'll see it goes to this data type selector. Here you need to specify which data type you want to read from a dynamic variable. So we need to pick one here from the list. This isn't the exhaustive list, by the way. You can make your own nodes, much like making your own dynamic variable receiver nodes. I'll put a link in the video description to that one. I'll also be doing a video on how to do it for this particular node type later as well. We're going to be using strings for this video as they're nice and visual. You can sort of see what's going on and we don't get confused with numbers and mathematics or anything like that. So let's go ahead and create a dynamic variable input string node. So to do that, I'm going to trigger on string here. And I'm going to double trigger in the world and you'll see that it gets entered. The first thing you'll notice is that this node is quite a lot sort of taller than most other nodes and wider. It's quite a big sort of chunky node. More on that in a moment when we look at dynamic variable with inputs. That one's very large. The first thing you might notice that's kind of unique about this node type is that there is an input box. This input box is the dynamic variable that you want to read using the dynamic variable input node. We're going to go ahead and enter space stroke food here. So what this means is we're looking in the dynamic variable space of space for a dynamic variable called food. With that entered, this node is now set up. Let's take a look at its outputs. The first output here is the value. This will match the data type of the node that you selected. So if it's an int here, it would be the green. If it was a float, it would be the blue, etc. Let's go ahead and pull out a ribbon for this. So I'm going to put my tip in, pull out a ribbon, hit secondary, and the same for this secondary value. This secondary value here is has value, which is a boolean. Let's pull this out and hit secondary. So that this is false right now, and that means that, hey, this node doesn't have a value. Let's go ahead and create a value for it. To do that, we can do that in a number of ways. We're going to be using the component method to do it. We can also use the logics method to do it later, but that's once I've covered those nodes. Let's do it with a component. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and on the variable space in the inspector here, I'm going to go ahead and hit the star This will create a child, variable space child here, and I'm going to rename this to food. Once this is renamed, I can attach the dynamic variable component to this inspector. Let's go ahead and go to attach component, data, dynamic value variable t, and then we'll select string. With this selected, you can see here that there is a variable name and value. More on this can be found in the components tutorial, which is the one before this, but we're going to go over a little bit of it now, which is for the variable name, we need it to be the variable that we're trying to create a value for, so in this case, space food. There's a quick tip here, which I use all the time, which is you can copy the value, or here, of this text box to this component and vice versa. So here I'm going to point my laser at space stroke food, grab space stroke food on my laser, and then drop it into variable name here. You can do this the other way too, so if I put space food 3, drag space food 3, put it back into here. There you go. That makes it super quick to set up these nodes here and to set up these components here and vice versa. You can kind of drag and drop them around. With this set, you'll see that we still don't have a value here. This is still null and this is still false. And that's because the dynamic variable input node needs to be parented within the hierarchy that you want to read from. So in this case, dynamic string variable here, this node, is parented to the world root, and this space is within the world, but one level lower than that. So to get a value out of this node, we're going to need to parent it to the variable space. Easiest way to do that is to just pack it, which you'll probably do anyway if you're going to be writing logics. So we'll select the variable space again, we'll hit star, and we'll see variable space child. I'm going to back out the child, and then type logics here. Then we're going to go ahead and pack variable space logics. So we'll grab that with a logics tooltip and go to set packing route, and then we'll aim at dynamic string variable space stroke food, hold secondary till our circle completes and let go, and that will pack it into the variable space. You'll see here that we've actually now packed that, and what does packing actually do? Packing just parents it to that place that you selected as the packing route. So you can now see dynamic variable input is there, parented within variable space dash logics. Let's go ahead and unpack this now. So I'm going to grab variable space dash logics and hit unpack, and you'll see that it's all unpacked. You'll see here that we now have the has value set to true, and that's because it's found that there is a dynamic variable with space stroke food, but it has no values, and I didn't set a value to it. I actually forgot to do that, but it's kind of good that I do that, because it means that you can actually get null here and true here, so do keep that in mind when you're writing logics to try and cope for that. Let's go ahead and update that. So on variable space here, I'm going to select food, and I'm going to go ahead and type some food in here. So let's go ahead and type cheese, which is a really good food here. And there you go. You'll see that the dynamic value variable has a value of cheese, and that this node has picked it up and has a value cheese. This has also remained true. So you can use this to see if there's a value, and then maybe display some different logics or do some different handling if there is no value for space stroke food. That is dynamic value input. Sorry, I always get this one. Dynamic variable input. These nodes get quite long in my head to remember, so I just look at this browser and we'll keep them clear in our head. Let's go for dynamic variable input with events next. Remember what I said that the previous node was big? This one's even bigger. Let's take a look. This one is probably the largest node in logics. I find that quite comical. It's very useful. I just find it funny because it's large. Let's go ahead and set up. So we can go ahead and grab space stroke food, drop it into here. And then if we take a look at the outputs here, we can get going. So you'll see that it's now got 2 more outputs, which is why it's the taller node here. It's got on-space linked and on-space unlinked. Let's pull out a display node for all of these. So we'll put in our logics tooltip and hit secondary for ribbon. And we'll pull one out for the value as well, and the has value as well. Now remember that because we haven't packed this into or parented it into the space, there's no value yet, so let's just do this quickly. As we've still got variable space logic set on our logics tooltip, we can just aim it at the node here and hold secondary and it'll pack it. And then we can just go ahead and unpack again. And you'll see that everything is correct. We've got the value of cheese and true here. Much like other event-based nodes, such as fire on true, fire on change, etc., the dynamic variable input with events node requires a user. It doesn't actually require one, it can operate without one, but I do recommend you put a user in here. That'll be the user which the impulses come out as being owned by. Let's go ahead and set this to host user, just to show you how to do it. So I'm going to go to users, host user, spawn that to the left here and plug it in. Now let's talk about these events, and let's actually generate an event that comes out here. So you'll see here that we've got onSpace linked and onSpace unlinked. These happen when the node itself gets linked to a space and unlinked from a space. What do we mean by that? So if I were to reparent this node or the logics or gadget that this node is a part of between spaces, then it will fire those events. To illustrate this, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit of hierarchy manipulation here. So we're going to turn to some empty space here in the distMeek space, hit create new empty object, and we're going to call this empty object not space, so we can find it later, so not space. And then we're going to go ahead and parent our logics, this variable space logics, by grabbing it and dropping it over to not space onto this not space area. And you'll see here that we got an impulse coming out of the onSpace unlinked node. And all of these have gone to null. So you'll see null here, false here, null here. And that's because it can no longer find that variable within that space. Take a look at part 1 and part 2, where I talk about finding spaces, where the components ascend through a hierarchy to try and find a space to register them with. The nodes are doing essentially the same thing here. You also see that the top one here has still got no impulse on it. Let's change that. So we're going to go ahead and parent our variable space logics back to variable space. So we'll grab variable space logics and parent it back across. And now you see that the top one has fired and everything's gone back to cheese true and cheese true. It is true that cheese is good. So that is a dynamic variable input and dynamic variable input with events. Wherever possible, I recommend using these for writing dynamic variable based logics, as they are a quick way to get the logics aware and able to read the value from your dynamic variables. They're not complicated either. You just parent them to the same space that you're in and you can have fun and go for it. You may come into issues with these if you use blueprints, for example. Blueprints are technically what's called a grabbable receiver. More information on that is in the video description. I'll put a link to a grabbable receiver video, and that the blueprint is parenting nodes to it when you put them on the blueprint. And so if the dynamic variable space that the blueprint is in is different from the space that the variable is in, then they can sort of interfere. So do keep that one in mind. These are very handy. If you want to just get the value of a variable at all times, use these. Do not use the next ones that we're going into. These are perfect if you don't need to do any sort of dynamic or varied reading. Just use these ones. With those ones out of the way, we're going to move on to the next one. I'm going to go ahead and clean up a little bit here so that we can focus. Interestingly enough, you saw that we had a pulse there for the unlinked. What happened there was because I grabbed the node, it got unparented from the space that it was in and parented to my hand. That's what happens when you grab something, it gets parented to your hand. And so that's why we got the onSpace unlinked node event coming out. All right, so let's go on to the other types of node. So we're going to go back to variables, and we're going to be covering read and write now. So read dynamic variable can be found here next to dynamic variable input. Let's go ahead and select it, and then we'll select string again, and we'll spawn it into the world. Now this one is a little bit different in that it doesn't have that text box. Instead, it has a text entry. This means you can do logics to create the string that goes into it. For example, you can append things to a string, or make a numeric string based on a numeric value, so food 4, food 5, etc. Or you can just type a value in, which is what we're going to do to keep things simple. So let's take a look at this. So we're going to jump to this variable name, which I was just talking about. We're going to pull out a ribbon, hit secondary here, and we're going to type in that variable that we've been using again, which is space stroke food. On the right here, you'll see similar outputs to the dynamic variable input node. They are value and has found value, which is a little bit different from has value. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But you'll see that these are null and that this is false. And that's because we need to specify a source. Now the source is where the read dynamic string component should look for, it's not the component node, sorry, where the read dynamic string node should look for to find that variable. If you remember when I talked about hierarchies in part 2, what this node will do is when you specify a slot to it, it will ascend up the hierarchy looking for a space to try and find that value for it. So what we can actually do here is link it to basically anything that is within the variable space. To illustrate this, I'm going to go up to the variable space up here. And I'm going to create a child, and I'm just going to name the child here to anything random. We'll just call it potato. And you'll see that this potato slot has no components on it, and it's just in that variable space. We're going to grab potato, hit secondary, which will spawn interface card for it, and then plug it into the top here. And when we plug it in, you'll see that we get cheese and true here. To illustrate how this is working, we can also go ahead and plug in the variable space itself. So let's go ahead and grab variable space. We'll put this above here, and we can plug this one in, and you'll see that we get the same value. However, if we plug in not space from over here, you'll see that it goes to null and false. And that's because our not space doesn't have a space/food value on it. You can dynamically set this read dynamic string. For example, you could have a variable that's a slot variable, or another dynamic variable, which is of type slot. Getting a bit meta there, but that does happen sometimes, where you're reading from. You could even descend through hierarchies using the get child nodes, etc., to kind of read through spaces, etc. So this node is great when you want to read from a space that you don't really own. If you own the space, you can use dynamic variable input, but if you don't own the space, or you're unsure of the space, or maybe the space is dynamic, you can read from it using read dynamic string, or read dynamic any data type. Again, here just to reiterate, these nodes work with any data type, and when you spawn them, they will list the data type that they're in. Just to illustrate that, I'm going to spawn read dynamic int. You'll see that we get read dynamic int, and the output is an int rather than a string here, but this remains a string because it's the variable name that you need to read from. That's reading. Let's cover writing. We'll head on back here, and we'll go to write dynamic variable. In write dynamic variable, we'll select string again, and we'll spawn this just below the read dynamic string so we can see the similarities. So write dynamic string has a lot more nodes that can come in and out of it, and that's because it's an event-based node. If we take a look at the top one here, you'll see it's write. This is much like the write node, the standard one that writes to any other field basically, in that it's what triggers the action. You'll see that the next part is the target. This is, again, the hierarchy that we need to search within. So this could be our potato slot here, or our variable space here. We're going to go ahead and use potato. Drop that in. And then it needs the variable name. So we can actually just use space food from up here and plug that in. And then the value. So this is the value we want to write it to. So here we can put maybe strawberry. And there we go. You'll see that the write dynamic string has two outputs. One is on success, and one is on not found. I'll illustrate what on not found is just in a moment, but let's show it working first. So if I go ahead and hit pulse here, you'll see that we get an output on success, and that's because it was written successfully. If I turn here to my variable space and I select the food slot where I put that component, you'll see space/food is now set to strawberry. Strange that I know what that is actually. I've still got that parented to the not space, so I need to relink read dynamic string back to an actual space that we're going to use. A quick note here that might be helpful is that if you've got an existing arrow like this, don't create another arrow by doing this, because then you'll have two arrows. Instead, use the existing arrow and just touch its tip, the fat end of it, and plug that in, and then you'll only have one arrow. That's a kind of tidier trick there for you. There you go. Now you'll see a read dynamic string has strawberry and true coming off it. Let's illustrate what happens with the on not found output. The on not found output will happen if there's not a matching space, or a space can't be found to put it. As an example here, what we're going to do is make sure that the not that one, actually variable space here. Make sure that the only direct binding is checked. And we're going to go ahead and change space food to space 5 food. So now there is no space 5 space anywhere within our dynamic variable setup. So we can go ahead and hit pulse here, and you'll see on not found happens because it couldn't find a place to put this. I think that should work actually without the dynamic only direct binding. I'll just put that on. Let me change that back to 5. 6. Yeah, there we go. Ignore the only direct binding there. I do talk about that one in the previous video. I just turned that on through honestly habit. If I see that off, I usually turn it back on again. I usually bind my variables directly to the space name there. See parts 1 and 2 for more information on only direct binding. So that is write dynamic string. We're going to go ahead and again clean up a little bit here. So we'll go ahead and remove these, because now we're going to go on to the third type of nodes, which are the ones which create or remove variables. Let's take a look at them. We're going to go over one really quickly because it's very similar to write, but it's called write or create dynamic variable. The difference here is that if it can't find the variable, it will create it. So I'm selecting a string one here, and we'll spawn it in. You'll see that there's a lot more inputs, and there's also an additional output. They are different things, and they mean different things, so we'll go over each one. The top one is just the initiator, but you'll see it says write or create this time, so we'll hit secondary. Write or create means that it will look in the target slot here, and we'll again set that to our potato slot here, which means it will look up and find variable space. It needs a variable name, so let's use, we can't use space food because we've already got that one. Let's use space weather and plug that one into variable name. Value is the value that should be written. So here we'll say snowy, it is winter after all. And that's the value that will be written. You'll see that there are now also two other inputs. Let's talk about those ones. So the first one here, which is create directly on target, I find this very useful if you're using this node. What this will do is it means it will create the dynamic value variable component directly on the target which is specified here. So in this case, we've specified the potato slot here. So what it will do is it will go to the potato slot and it will create the component here. Because what this node actually does is it just creates a dynamic variable component on the slot which is targeted. If this is set to true, which I was just talking about, then it will create it on the slot which is directly targeted, so in this case the potato slot. But if this is set to false, it will go up to the root of the variable space, in this case variable space here, and it will create it here. This is why I say that this input is useful. I always set this to true and try and make it that I'm not going to the top of the variable space here, because what happens there is you end up with a lot of variables at the top of the variable space, and it's very difficult to read through them. If you've ever scrolled through an avatar, all the components on an avatar, you'll know that's quite difficult. If you create 100 variables, if that's set to false, then you're going to have a bad time with a lot of variables on there to take a look at. To illustrate the difference between both, I'm also going to give you a visual record of that, so I'm going to go ahead and hit pulse here. But to do that, first we're going to need to talk about the outputs. So the outputs for this node are on created. This happens if the variable is created. On written, which happens if the variable is written to but not created. And on not found, which happens if it can't find it again. Let's do these in turn. So we'll do on created first. So I've got this set to true. I've got this set to space weather and snowy. Let's hit pulse. We'll see that on created fired. Let's go ahead and select our potato slot here. And you'll see that we've got a new component on our potato slot here called dynamic value variable string, space weather with a value of snowy. Let's update this to snowy with way more Y's and hit pulse again. And you'll see that the second impulse fired, and that's because this node looked at the target and it said, hey, the variable already exists, so I'm going to write it, I'm not going to create it, hence write or create, and so it just wrote it, which is why we got this second output and not this first. If I change this to a variable that we didn't have, let's say weather2, and I hit pulse, you'll see that we get the top one again. I'll also use this opportunity to create weather3 with this impulse, this input set to false. And you'll see that, again, we get the output there on created. And if we go up to the variable space, you'll see that the dynamic variable value variable component here is set to space stroke weather3, and it's created on that root space. So like I said, this could get quite crazy here. For example, if I went and I did weather7, pulse, weather8, pulse, you see we're getting a lot of components here. And if you're doing that for multiple subjects, multiple types, multiple everything, this is just going to become a mess pretty quickly. So again, I recommend leaving that as true wherever possible. On not found will again be if it can't find a space. So if I just go ahead and do our old trick where I name it space and then a number, it won't be able to find that dynamic variable space to put it in, so you'll get on not found pulsing here. The last input, which I actually forgot about, sorry about that, is create non-persistent. I talk about persistence in my video on persistence, so I'll link that video description. Each component within Neos has a persistent value. So you'll see here, dynamic value variable string space weather3 has a persistent checkbox. If this is unchecked, that means that this component itself will not save when the object is saved. So if you use here false on that, let's go ahead and set this up. Now we'll do weather80 so we know we've got it. You'll see that the, oh, that's interesting. Oh no, I need to set that to true. I'll have to just add a number there. There we go. So now you'll see that it's been created with that persistent checkbox checked off. So what this means is that this value component will not be saved when the object is saved. That includes like if you put the logics into an avatar, if you put the logics onto a gun or a gadget, or if you put the logics into a world, it won't save that value. It will be gone the next time that avatar, world, object, etc. is loaded. That can be good to kind of mitigate this problem where you've got lots of variables in the root space, but again, if you use the one above it, then you can sort of filter them down to where they might make more sense, etc. Right, that is the write or create dynamic string, or variable. I'm getting really confused with the names of these, and that's because they change based on the node menu and then when you spawn them. I actually like that they do that because it becomes very clear what data type you're talking about, but when you're looking at the node menu here, you might get them a little bit confused. Just spawn one around in the world if you do get confused, and it should clear it up. Right, so let's go on to create. Create is quite similar to write, but it does a few different things. So we'll go to create string. I'm going to leave the right one there just so we can talk about it. So it looks almost identical. Again, we've got the right. That's a bug. I'll report that. This here should just say create, but it says write or create. That should just say create, because the create dynamic value. Create dynamic variable node, in this case create dynamic string, it will only create, it will refuse to create a duplicate variable. So if the variable already exists, it will refuse to create it again. To illustrate this here, what we're going to do is first of all create a variable and then try and create it again, and we'll see how the node behaves. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in our potato space again. I'm going to use that trick where I grab the fat part of the arrow and plug it into the top here. For the second part here, we'll need a variable name. So I'm going to go ahead and use space / I'm running out of things to use, so I'm just going to use something. And we'll set that to, let's clear these out. And we'll go ahead and set that to yes. So we're creating a variable called something with an initial value of yes. That's also very clear distinction to make. The input here, the second string here, in case this is a different type, it'll be the data type that it is. It's the initial value only, it's not an updated value. The two inputs here, create directly on target. We'll set the first one to true, like I always recommend. We'll leave the persistence alone. But now we can look at the outputs. The outputs are on created, on already exists, and on not found. So the difference here being that the middle one here is on already exists, over here on create dynamic variable, and on over here on write or create dynamic variable, it's on written. So on exists will fire if the variable already exists, but in this case it doesn't because we don't have space to something. So if you hit pulse, you'll see that the top one fires, which is on created. If we go ahead and look at our potato slot, you'll see that we get space something and it has been created and it says yes. Let's hit this again and see what happens. Let's hit pulse. You'll see that the second output has fired, and that's because this variable already exists. It won't update it. So if I change this to no and hit pulse, it's going to fire this one and it won't update it. Just going to refresh that just to prove it. You'll see here again, space something is still set to yes. That's because this node will only create, it won't write or create. I will file that bug later because that should just say create. But that is create for you. So it will only create, it won't write or create. You can basically think of write or create as being the write dynamic variable and the create dynamic variable put together into like a setup that you could actually make with nodes and ifs and logics, etc. But it's done it for you. If you are unsure if a variable exists and you want to write to it, use write or create. If you want to be explicit, use create. Or if you know that the variable exists because you've made it ahead of time or you know it's there, you can go ahead and use write. That's the create and the write or create nodes. There is now 3 left. These are the dangerous ones, and so I've left them for last because I don't really recommend using them as they can get quite dangerous, but I will go over them. Let's go ahead and delete this and clean up a little bit. We'll leave those slot cards there so I can play with them. And let's go for the delete dynamic variable. And again, we'll do delete dynamic variable string. This one's a little bit smaller, and that's because it just deletes the dynamic variable. So in this case, it has a delete input. You can plug in the potato as the source, much like the write or the create ones. It needs a source to take a look at. It doesn't need that create directly on target because it will go up and down the hierarchy looking for that variable component and just remove it if it needs to. In most cases, it would actually just go up to the dynamic variable space and then you ask the space where the variable is, etc. I say up and down to try and visualize what you can do if you're trying to figure out what it's doing, which is sort of scan up and down your hierarchy and find out what's going on about. Don't worry about it, doing full scans or anything like that. The next one here is variable name, which is the variable to delete. You'll see that the outputs here are on deleted or on not found. Well, let's go up to the top of our variable space and tidy up a little bit. So we've got this weather 809. Let's put space strict weather 809 into here, and then hit, let's pull out these first. There we go. Hit pulse, and you'll see that it pulsed on deleted, and that space weather 809 does no longer exist. Let's go ahead and delete space weather 80 as well. We'll hit pulse, and you'll see that space weather 80 has now also disappeared. Alright, the next one here is on not found. So again, that's if the variable can't be found. So we've just actually deleted space weather 80, so it shouldn't be able to find it. Let's hit pulse, and you'll see again it says not found there, which means it hasn't found it. Like I said, this one's a little bit dangerous. Only delete variables that you know that you don't need, and please don't delete other people's variables. That's kind of crude and rude. Let's head back to the next one, which is clear dynamic variables of type. This one is even more dangerous. So let's go to string. This one will clear all dynamic variables of type string from a variable space. Very, very dangerous. So we're going to go ahead and drop in our target slot, which is potato again. The top here is clear, and then this one here is space name. So this is the space that we want to clear from. And you'll see here that the output is on not found, on cleared, and cleared count. Much like other nodes which have an output which has impulses on it, this value here will only be valid for the length of this impulse. So you need to use it or lose it. We're going to use it. So to do that, we're going to use a regular storage variable, which is in variable storage. Int. We're going to go to back, and we're going to go to actions, write, and then we're going to plug the target of the write value into this int, and then plug both of these in, and this in, and then this in here, and then we'll pull out a display node for this as well. So now we'll be able to get the output here, and the number that was cleared here. So let's go ahead and do this, hit pulse. You'll see that it pulsed, and that we cleared 7 dynamic variables. If we now look back at our glorious tree of variables that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes. Again, apologies for the length. There's nothing on food. There's nothing on variable space except for the variable space component. There's nothing on potato either. It's completely barren and empty. That's why that node is very, very dangerous. Could be useful if you want to just sort of start again on an object, or you want to, completely rehash it or something. So, you've made V1 of a gun and you want to make V2. You could use that to completely clear out everything and start again. If you did want to clear absolutely everything, though, you can go back to the last node, which is clear dynamic variables. I know why this is here. I just it makes me scared that it's here. This will clear dynamic variables of all types. It won't care if it's a string or a number. It will just go ahead and clear them. So here on food, I'm just going to create 2 variables of different types, and we're not going to bother putting a value on them. We're just going to create them. So dynamic value variable. Let's do a bool. We'll do data dynamic value variable string. We do need to give them a name, so we'll say here space, and then I'll just do A, and then space B. So they're both on the space variable space. Let's go ahead and plug everything in. So I'll actually just go ahead and delete this one and replace it with this one. So put that pulse in there, potato slot in, our space name, and then hook these up and go. Let's hit pulse. You'll see that we got 2 here, and if we take a look back at our food slot, there is now nothing on it. There you go. I know that was a whirlwind. You might have been able to hear some fatigue on me. These long videos are kind of hard to record, but I do hope that that was useful. Let me know if you have any questions, or if you want me to go over anything in additional detail. I will be creating some more videos after this, which will be sort of more varied, that will go over sort of how I use dynamic variables and how to create systems. I'm toying with sort of doing a HP system and then maybe an ammo system, just to get you using these nodes without, out in the wild doing an actual implementation, rather than just theoretical stuff here where we're messing around with sort of nonsensical variable names. So that might be more up your street if you're more sort of a hands-on learner. Look out for those coming soon. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and I'll get back to you soon with another tutorial. Bye-bye.